Hello, I'm John Coleman from Apocatastasis, an Institute for the Humanities and Alternative College and High School here on New Milford, Connecticut, USA. The purpose of this broadcast is to dig into our upcoming Fearology 101 certificate course with Dr. R. Michael Fisher. And Dr. Fisher has all of the information for this really cutting edge study, and I look forward to getting into that. I will actually save on that account. I will actually save any announcements. This will be sufficient, this whole broadcast. And I'm looking forward to this course coming up. And hopefully you will too by the end of this chit chat. Dr. Fisher, welcome. How have you been?
Well, welcome, John. I'm doing pretty good. Thank you very much. Certainly the world is challenging, so the ups and downs of a very difficult time we're going through, but it's also, and I know you know this too, it's also a time of rebirth and arising from the dust, so to speak, of a lot of collapse and a lot of fear and terror that's at the base, but also, that can often bring out some of the best of us. And so that's my intention is it'll also bring out the worst. But we can re-guide some of that. And so the Fearology 101 course, I think, is going to be useful for people to, use as a kind of guide for themselves in these very difficult times.
Yes, I find myself interested in mythology as I am. I find myself thinking about Ragnarok, and from the ashes comes the rebirth, is the Norse mythology there. So we're at in this hour, it so often feels. And before we get into this course, Dr. Fisher, what have you been up to this semester? We're broadcasting this in the autumn of 20 and 25. What have you been up to in terms of your research in particular? I know earlier this semester, we had the honor here at Apocatastasis of publishing your dictionary, Thesaurus of Fear. What have been some of your instructional obligations that you've seen to in your writing interests and artistic ones besides?
Sure. Well, artistically and educationally, Barbara and I, we had spent really time co-editing a journal issue, special journal issue in Artazine, a journal for arts and education. And that was specializing around matrixyal theory and the work of Brockal Ettinger, a psychoanalyst, philosopher, artist. And that was really a pretty exciting journey to co-edit, with people from around the world. And we finished that issue, and we were, took a lot of work, but it was very rewarding. So it starts to build a community about thinking in education beyond just sort of the traditional ways that we think about, certainly patriarchy and the phallic world, and much more oriented around the maternal as well, as the in more balance. So that was that issue. And then I've been working on preparing for an art show. So that's coming up this weekend. I'm going to be going out in public, and I do art as a regular practice as well. And a lot of that is, in a sense, meditation work, but it's also research work in a way. I like to use art as a way of thinking. I was just watching a video, I should say, on the life of Leonardo da Vinci. And one of the things that he continually said about painting and drawing is that he said, I'm interested in the mind of the figures and the people and the things that he draws or paints. So he's interested in a way you could say, how creator thinks. He was fascinated by that, and everything he drew and painted had that attention to the mind behind the image. And that really intrigues me, because I think I do that intuitively as well. I am interested in form, just the basic form, and not just the content of what you're putting on the surface, but design. And that is really the design of creation itself, which is in all things. So just another exploration. So I have that intellectual philosopher, writer. I have that artist, explorer, inquirer as well. And then, the vocabulary on cultural critique, a cultural vocabulary published by Apocatastasis Institute, was my ongoing interest in how do we critique culture itself, And when does culture, in some sense, create itself as a sacred cow that cannot be critiqued because somehow it's sacred? And I'm going, well, maybe there's perspectives that you actually can critique culture in a way outside of culture. Like you can step out enough to come and look at it. It's not like you're trying to, destroy or make it all bad. But I think it's just like with fear. How can we study fear? By being able to step outside of the ways we've been taught about fear and be able to look at it, let's just say, more objectively and definitely more prospectively, at multiple perspectives. And that's when you start moving right to metacognition. You're not just inside your subject, and you're not attached to a meaning or a definition because it says so in the dictionary or the encyclopedia, and or the historical or even the popular accounting of that's what that means. Fear means this. And I think that's constantly what I'm always doing, is I'm very interested in these metacognitive. And I think you and I do that with education as well, as probably many of your instructors at the Institute do. Is we're not just interested in being inside education as it's been conceived and imagined. And that's why the historical perspective is so important. What was education processes like historically, and even way back to imagining what it was like prehistorically. And then where are we going in the future? How do we want to reimagine, the very nature of education, and then certainly pedagogy. So this new course I have is kind of a very interesting and exciting, simple, really simple. And that comes after 4 decades of trying to teach on fear and finding it very difficult to get people interested. And then I said, well, you know what? I think this might work. It's really simple. And here's where the pedagogy came in for me as I was creating the course. Let people pick their own content. I'm putting out 250 videos or so, right? Which I've done on my YouTube channel. A lot of them around fear and fearology, because that's in fearlessness. Those are my special topic. But there's probably 30 or 40% that are on other topics, but related always in some way. And so the student actually gets to come into my life, right, as a scholar, as a teacher. And you get to kind of go into your life, and you've kind of laid it all out, or a lot of it, the content, plus my publications that I've written on and put on PDFs that are online, hundreds of those. And so it's kind of interesting to just create a course where there's a topic, right? The study of fear and its relationship to life. So that's the definition, simple definition of fearology. And then let them come in and decide which 20 videos they're going to watch, because that's, to get the certificate, you only need to watch 20 videos. So I'm not overloading on the front end what it is I think they should be learning. And I've actually even refused making objectives for this. I basically said, the takeaways will be your takeaways of what you've found in your investigation. I'm here to reflect back on you those takeaways, those things that you think you've learned. And I haven't come in on the heavy end to say, well, you really need to look at this because this is fundamental to learning this, and this is fun. There's a place for that kind of learning. And that's the scaffolding that you have often speak about. But I think there's a different kind of scaffolding that is just a relational scaffolding. In other words, the student comes in to learn about the darn instructor, the scholar, right? And the scholar is kind of putting it out there. Well, you choose a bunch of things. Here's sort of what I think would be a minimum for you to study fearology on just an intro level. And I'm trusting that you'll do it. I'm trusting that you're going to come back to me and then you say, okay, I've finished those. We've made some comments. I know that they're looking at the videos. You keep a log of what you've done. Keep a log of what your hours are. And then at the end, we're going to come back and we're going to design an evaluation of what your learning is. And you're going to do that with me, because I want to not just evaluate you on some kind of abstract front loading that I think is super important, even though I have things I think are important, but not on a 101 level. A 101 level, you ought to be able to do your journey. You ought to not even agree with me on fundamental things that I might front end load, right? My biases, my politics, my critical approaches, and so on. I'm really excited to not put that on the front end. When you go into 201, if you take the 201 course to the 301, I'm going to front load more, right? I'm going to come in and start pushing you in places where I think, and it's not just you as a learner, it's pushing in places that your habits, right, and your socialization, the society itself, they tend to only let us go in certain directions in understanding this idea of fear and fearlessness. So I think that's where I'll put more front loading in. I'll have a little bit more design, but you'll still have lots of freedom as a learner. But the 101 is going to be fun because it's wide open. I mean, the internet is absolutely open. I mean, as long as you people have a computer, access to a computer in English, of course, language is the only language I have for it at this time. So a very interesting pedagogical maneuver there, John. I don't know if you've tried anything kind of in that style, or that. I'm curious what your comments are about just that style of pedagogy for an intro kind of level to a subject matter. Yeah, that's one of the documents that people might choose, but again, I'm not actually picking what people should read. I think I have one paper I says you ought to read this one core PDF paper. Maybe 20 pages. And it's called Fearology Biography of an Idea. I published it in 2001. It's one of these technical papers from that same series you were just showing. And I just feel like, okay, one paper I'll ask them to read. So, in 6 to 8 months, that's not a lot of forcing by an instructor, right? It's like a lot of freedom there to be an explorer.
Yes, and what we're looking at here, before I answer Dr. Fisher's question, is the Fearology Center's website. And you can see all sorts of audio-visual recordings and textual downloads here. And to Dr. Fisher's query, yes, I think this is, I think, quite a via media between, so-called self-directed learning or guided learning, and then also towards my comments in our promotional shorter video, also towards recapturing what is the purpose of schools. So you asked me about, this pedagogical approach. Part of the reason, frankly, one goes to a school, we ought to go to a school of any level, certainly by secondary or tertiary learning, is indeed to learn from the unique scholar. Too often, I speak from these United States down here. I imagine it's probably the same in Canada, maybe not quite as bad, but the teacher is basically a manager in these United States. There's very little freedom. And in fact, especially when you come to high school or below, you don't even assume the teacher has any original thoughts of their own, let alone publications.
Right. So true, so true.
And there is no reason, I've said this for 10 years in my writing, there's no reason high schoolers and even junior high scholars and teachers should not be publishing and having original ideas. But the reality is the field and what the field weeds out is original thinking. The field ought to be given to that, but it weeds in favor of manager sorts, and that's great. We need managers for Filene's and for Macy's and for Arby's, which I worked at for some years, a fast food place. Okay, great. Alhamdulillah, we have managers, but we don't need managers in the classroom. We need scholars in the classroom. And yes, to your point and your question, Dr. Fisher, I think this is both flexible, which I think scratches an itch at this moment in terms of society and what people are looking for in knowledge and in formal instruction, and also helping to restore. Apocatastasis is a Greek word which means restoration, helping to restore what the teacher is in the classroom and why the student is there. So yeah. I hope those sentiments convey, answer your question there.
Yeah, no, thank you. That's really good. Yeah, a couple more things there on the website. You can check that out anytime. I think the Fearology Center, which is one of the sponsors of this certificate, the Fearology Center is a center within the Apocatastasis Institute. And then I'm also sponsoring it from, which is my original organization, the In Search of Fearlessness Research Center and Institute, which started in 1990. So it's kind of again a way for me to have these sort of fluid organizations, right, or institutionals for research for my educator, for my teacher, that I can sit in. And sure, I would have loved it if the funding would have shown up and there'd be a great institution and there'd be maybe a physical space and so on. And I know that's something that you are continually working on. And it's sort of an advantage and a disadvantage. There's something real advantageous also about being in flow and not having all that infrastructural pressure and demand. So it's a combination, and I think we're all both exploring. So this is just my latest exploration, and I'm just glad to take any questions or thoughts you want to push me into here. Go ahead, John.
Great. And just for the audience and for our, Dr. Fisher here, if there's ever a delay between our back and forth, it's just because I'm muting and unmuting, and Chromebooks will work when Chromebooks want to. So anyway, to follow-up questions, thank you for this invitation. On your site, which I'll bring up here, you mention, as you're laying out the Fearology Center and this whole discipline, you mentioned, ooh la la, sexology. As a historian, I'm aware of other, subtopics in my vocation, is the Annales School, or Marxist history, or feminist history, or so-called Black studies, and so forth, where whether it's sexology or these other ones, or in other disciplines, you have similar, plucky ideas, which start off outside the academy altogether, scorned, shut out. I could use more rough language, but nevertheless, the case is that there are many disciplines that we take as mother's milk in modern academia, race studies and whatever, and we don't realize they were locked out at one point, and they were ignored and ridiculed, and then they eventually became accepted. How would you rate, Dr. Fisher? How would you rate the acceptance of Fearology by your colleagues personally, in your travels? I know you've taught in these United States, you've taught in Canada, maybe internationally beyond that scope, online. How would you explain the acceptance, or describe the acceptance, compared to sexology, Black studies, women's studies, so forth?
Yeah, no, thank you. It's good. And that's an important question for anyone who says, well, why would I want to get a certificate in Fearology and maybe even go on to 201, 301 higher levels? And I basically think that there will be, quote, a career path here and a research path. It could be a professional. It may be in the future. I don't know how far. But I think it's going to be legitimate and accepted, like sexology is, for example, today. You can actually get a certificate, a degree, a diploma, probably a professional licensing in sexology. And there's been other disciplines that have been similar. And, they were always on the margins, and a lot of them, not all. And then certainly Fearology has been on the margin, because the hardest thing has been to convince scholars and those who are already practicing in disciplines. Psychology is, thinks it owns, fear. Sorry, but it does. And I'm going, historically, that's not even accurate, number one. Philosophy, theology was very interested in fear and has been part of, accumulating some of the first reflective knowledges about those. And then I would argue even those forms of philosophy formally, or even theology formally, I would argue that experientially, humans have always been very interested in fear. And that doesn't mean they've always been systematic or had methodologies complicated. They didn't have modernism. They didn't have technologies for learning, etc., like we have, or the time to even do those kinds of studies. But the argument here is fear has been central to the human experience, and humans have always been very interested in it. Why? Because they want to understand how to manage it well. I think humans instinctively know if you manage fear well, it can serve you as survival, quote, needs, and or just be a very good motivator for you, to push you to risk more, to be creative more, right? To do something outside the norm of that social grouping. And you can go back as far as you want. Anytime humans get together, just like a social animal, there's conformity. There's rules, there's going to be leaders, there's going to be the alpha male, the alpha female, right? It's like, this is the fundamental part to me of any educational path. Recognize there's social conformity, recognize there's people and structures going to be managing that, including simple taboos, laws, regulations, rules, and sometimes it's very formal, like as in legal codes. Yeah, so basically all cultures, as I understand, they do know that a certain amount of managerial, social, organizational structure to live in any kind of grouping, even very small ones, like a small tribe or whatever, large up to a city, right, or a world or a nation. They know that it's not good to have everybody just conforming to those rules, laws, and regulations completely. So we can get really dumb. We can get insular. We can get, incursive, where we only can think within that particular set of thinking and assumptions that we make about the world. Cultures have parts where they allow leaks, and sometimes it's not conscious, sometimes it's just explosive, where somebody thinks outside the box. Leonardo da Vinci all of a sudden goes and does something nobody else has done. Another inventor does the same thing. So these are historical precedents for, we want to learn how to conform, but we also want to learn how to unconform. My argument being, in a social species, fear and taboos, these organizational structures, they're very implicit or explicit. They can also be threats. If you go outside of the norm, you could actually get punished or killed. Or maybe you will get killed because you do something that's too risky and the consequences of your risk were too much. So societies are always implicitly and explicitly managing this dynamic of diversity, creativity, and risk. And that is really the fundamental reason I say that humans understand fear is important to maintain certain social structure and order, and fear is very important to also know and understand and how to manage it well, so you don't get contained and overly controlled in those social structures. Even so-called good social structures, seemingly even healthy social structures, they may still trap and entrap creativity and limit the adaptability of that society or culture. If you lose adaptability, then when conditions change, you may be really good culture, really stable under certain conditions. The environmental conditions change, or all of a sudden you got a new neighbor who's a powerful leader, and they have really good armies. If you're not adapting quickly enough to those situations, right, this is where you're going to basically lose your integrity and your resilience to adapt. So fear is at the base of adaptability, is my argument, biologically, culturally, and I would say even spiritually. That's why you want to study fear. So trying to now start fearology, which is your original question, was people do not seem to accept very well, as my experience over 40 years, trying in different disciplines. There's some nods and say, oh, that's interesting, but not a serious take-up. And so the idea to even name it as fearology, I says, well, I'll name it. People have named sexology. A lot of people didn't want to touch sex for a long time. I mean, it's a huge taboo subject. And it took decades and decades for, sexology to arise as something legitimate. And I'm saying the same with fearology. It's going to take a while, but I'm ahead of the curve. I want students and learners who want to be on the edge of the curve, prepping for where we're going. You can join this movement really to become, really, what does it mean? You don't have to call yourself a fearologist. That's not the point of the certificate. You could though. And it may be a really serious research field as well in the future. And I think it could, and it's open for it. But no, it hasn't been accepted well, John, around the world, except in where I get most of my uptake of interest is in Asia and Africa. And this less so in the Western and the European traditions. There's just, you could maybe argue and think about why that is. We could speculate on it, but it's a pretty big speculation. But there is something that tells me that when you move into, let's call it not first world developed countries, haven't gone through the same degree of industrialization, complex capitalistic, incorporation. Those earlier societies with, let's say more agrarian, haven't fully come through modernity and industrialization or digitalization age, or even invested in capitalism to the same degree. I think they have an intelligence that's still alive that goes, yes, fear is very important to understand and work with and be conscious and critical of. And I think once people are bought into a long tradition of capitalism, modernism, for a long, long period of time, fear has become as Brian Masumi says, fear is an organizational trade system. It's like money system. And so once you've bought into that, everybody's playing the fear game, how to manipulate who, how to deceit who, lie to. All of that's based on a sense of not trust. So it's based on a not a healthy fear. I think those earlier cultures, there's people that have really taken it seriously, and not a lot, but a handful, and some have written some very good work, and they are really respectful of my work. So that's my short answer is there seems to be something that's happened in the last historical period where people really don't want to look at fear too closely, generally. That doesn't mean there aren't scholarship in fear studies. There are. And there's histories of fear done and so on. You will come across that if you do listen to my videos.
Yes, I watch a fair amount of news from Africa and what they call West Asia. We call the Middle East, and Far Asia, the Orient. And it really is sometimes like watching something from 100 years ago or 50 years ago in terms of the sentiments of people. Of course, the killing part is, all things being equal, eventually capitalism will catch up with them and other modes of operation, unfortunately, in my opinion. Yeah. But for the moment, and for the remainder of our lives, we can enjoy more pristine cultures, and who knows what will happen in intervening. But yes, very interesting observation in any case, Dr. Fisher, where there is still interest and growing interest in fearology, and frankly, where there is academic and intellectual vitality for new subjects. Getting back to an earlier point you made in this explanation, and talking about verbing fearlessness, it is, and also kind of segueing with my point about teachers having become and chosen to be managers, it is a killing shame that academics, even in tertiary education or college education, are such followers. I mean, the whole, right or wrong, that's another discussion. We could do a whole show on it. Whether the modern academy, modern since the 19th century, should be predicated on constantly having new publications, new ideas, the addiction to novelty, therefore the shucking of the past and received wisdom. We can have that discussion some other time. But if you're going to have an academy predicated on novelty, frankly, there is an internal contradiction that it chooses for its managers, frankly, so-called scholars. It chooses subservient sorts. I had a discussion with an adult student yesterday as of this broadcast, and she brought this up with her husband, who is in this world, or kind of in this world, because of his own career path. came into academia a little bit later in life and has a bit more experience, and he's coming against an institutional framework which is full of people that got their PhDs when they're 24, 25, have never left the academy, are totally, in the worst sense, institutionalized, and will not, to your point, will not rock the boat with new knowledge in a discipline and a vocation which is predicated on novelty. There is an internal contradiction, and it's so refreshing at Apocatastasis to run this course where, devil may care, as we say in America, with what the surrounding field might think. The point is, we're verbing academic excellence. We're verbing academic inquisitiveness, and I don't know if you have any thoughts to develop on the matter there.
Yeah, there's a phrase that somebody has linked to Kierkegaard at one time, and I've never been able to fully track it, but apparently Kierkegaard, this great existentialist philosopher, a couple hundred years ago, said we require an epistemological fearlessness, and that is being able to not get caught, you see, in just the one discipline, the one orientation of knowledge. So epistemic is the way of knowing, right? So that we have multiple ways. Now, people do here and there talk about multiple ways of knowing, but a lot of those people, or most of them, any theories I've ever seen, do not look at, but when is that epistemology, this pursuit of knowledge, fear-based itself? In other words, you can have multiple. The multiple may mean nothing if you still are, they're all fear-based, right? You're just looking at multiple, but it's still fear-based. I think that's the worst downside of pluralism. When it's an ideological pluralism, we should be looking at multiple perspectives. But if somebody dares says, well, I don't want to look at everything multiple perspective because that may not be useful, and I feel like you're trying to control my knowledge, and they get all upset. Oh, then you're anti-pluralist. You see, it's like, and I'm going to see, you're already fear-based yourself in your own pluralism. In other words, you want to impose it ideologically on the rest of the world. So fear-based is one of the core concepts that students will explore. They'll come to try to find out what that means to them, which is very different than saying something, you may have fear. There may be fear that's motivating a certain pursuit of knowledge. It's very different to then say, but it's actually fear-based. And so once you get to that, to me, that's the beginning of ideology. So how do you define fear-based? There's many ways. I just simply say, well, it's when, more than 51% of your motivation is based in fear. So I'm leaving a lot of room for, you can have pursuits that there's still fear involved. It could be the fear of death that you're trying to avoid. It could be the fear you don't want to have measles, so you want to look for a vaccine. There could be all kinds of fears that are actually motivating in ways. But when it's fear-based, that's when basically people want to exclude other kinds of knowledges, right? And people want to exclude, I'm going to say very broadly, we have been taught to exclude even examining whether knowledge is fear-based or not. In other words, the pursuit of research, the pursuit of teaching, when is that actually running on a fear-based structure design or fear-based architecture? That's a really huge referential point. And I think, you could, again, use other languages in more classical societies. I would say, is it when is knowledge based on evil? That was historically and classically really important. Was it based on the will of God, or was it based on an anti-will of God, right? An anti-God-like spirit. In other words, so that's what you could trace that is probably like what I'm trying to do. And I'm trying to say fear-based is not good. I'm not saying fear is bad. I'm saying, but fear-based is when that's ideological. And to be able to recognize that is really important to understand when you get into the fear-based, the literature, not fear-based, but just the literature on fear. I find it all so inadequate. There literally is no synthesizer of fear knowledge on this planet that I know of. to the degree. And I'm not bragging. I'm just saying I've looked. I just looked because I was interested. It's not there. We don't have a synthesis. And I think this was probably happening again in a lot of the sexual knowledge that was on the planet about sex and sexuality. No one, it took a long time for someone to synthesize that across cultures, across time. That's a huge synthesis, right? It requires a lot of modern technologies and research and years and decades and decades and decades, and hopefully more than one researcher, But I would like to have many other researchers doing what I do, John, but there is not. There is not. I can tell you one from, Nepal, who now lives in Hong Kong, and he sort of was, I met him in 2014 in Desh-Suba, and he can hardly speak English. He's not an English speaker first, right? He's not an English, but he can write pretty good in English, but he's not an English speaker first. And so he can't really communicate what he was doing all these years. And then when we met in 2014, because I saw his book on fearism, philosophy of fearism, I went, my gosh, you're thinking like I am. I found one person after all these decades. And of course, he's not in academia. he's a security guard.
Yeah. Let me interject here. He's not in academia like the in the mainstream so-called, because he's been shut out like all of us have been from this dying husk of a system. That's why he's doing security and things. I cut you off though. Please go on.
It's true, but so this is the beauty of Fearology. What I'm doing is I'm kind of playing with, as I said, you don't have to call yourself a Fearology, but you could call yourself a Fearologist after this certificate. And frankly, you can call yourself a Fearologist if you want. I really don't care. See, so there's not some kind of hierarchical, I'm setting the referent for everything. I'm just saying I've done the homework. I'll set a reference for what makes a good Fearologist. But if you got another idea, go for it. And guess what? You publish it, I'll probably come and critique it. If you don't like what I'm saying, you come and critique me. Then we'll let the people decide when they read our critiques. You see, so again, I'm not trying to build this huge kingdom, right, of the elite form, but I am being, quote, elitist in saying there is elite knowledge that's worth knowing, and it takes a lot of discipline, and it takes a lot of systematization, and it takes, hopefully, critique from your peers. I've started a journal, the International Journal of Fear Studies. That, unfortunately, has not been able to find a home. We thought we had a home, then the home was dissipated. The university says, no, you guys can't publish with us. We're not putting it on our website anymore. I've been kicked off. And so for 3 years, I'm going without a home for the journal. So it's not producing articles, but it did for 2 years because I had access to a university, because I was not an emeritus, but a former student of that university, and they gave me access to their library, digital library, and then they cut it off. So what's happening is we're just not getting the good accumulation of knowledge on fear right now. When I talk about accumulation of systematic and critical, John, see, there's lots of people publishing books on fear. I have a whole 100 books here on fear, but nobody's synthesizing that damn stuff. And so a learner, right, or a public person, a professional, whoever, they pick up a book, they get one or two, and they go, okay, oh, this is what fear is about. Yeah, biased by that person, biased by their training, and there's no systematic, you have no way to even critique that knowledge until there's something like a field of fearology. Then you have the possibility of critiquing that knowledge. I don't know if there's equivalent in history like that, because it's the same problem, isn't it? Everybody's got their perspective on history. Then there's all these, again, Black studies, or you get this particular kind of studies, and then people want to shape history. And is there people that actually are doing like a synthesis, an integral, holistic approach to history? I doubt it. I doubt if it's in any field, but maybe it is.
Yes, a few points here. In addition to what I've said before, just to follow up on what Dr. Fisher says, besides, again, recovering with this course, and then, please God, with Apocatastasis and with many other noble works besides, why do schools exist going forward? Because I believe, as Dr. Fisher's aware, and as many people on these channels and sites have heard me say, that there is going to be a collapse. I don't say tomorrow, I don't say next year, 5 years, but when the education field, as we call it, collapses, it will come down very, very fast. It will come down faster than disposable cameras did in 2001 or 2. I've already said that one of the enduring reasons for a school is the unique insight of the scholar, which Dr. Fisher just elaborated on some more. And then also the synthesis of knowledge, or what I call the scaffolding, but the same concept. Again, organizing knowledge. We have, at the moment, a great access to information. I wonder if that will continue, but that's another discussion. How free the internet will be,
Yes.
with different IDs and so forth that they're rumbling out in Europe. But one thing, Michael, you just brought up is discipline. I would add this to be the third. I would add this to be the third, and have this to be the third reason schools endure is the discipline of knowledge. When we knock off soon enough, I can spend the rest of the day going from hyperlink to hyperlink to these books back here. Do people still read books? I can go ride my bike down to the library. I can go back on the hyperlinks and to scrolling all night, whatever. And we can have all sorts of data, but also discipline. You brought up the aspect of discipline. And frankly, and I even see this at the Institute with our language courses, and I even told this to the people who join, the very fact that on Tuesdays we meet to study Greek and Latin alternatively keeps us all a bit more on the ball. The fact that we know, even in a very informal setting, that, we're going to have a few minutes every week to go through these languages. There is a communal discipline that happens. Religions know this. You mentioned religions are aware of fear. Religions know discipline. Religions know also the power of the erotic. I heard a Muslim guy say this once, you had to, this is nonsense that we had to wait till Freud to understand the power of sexuality. Look at a Muslim who's, how they dress. They're aware of how powerful sex is, or a monk or whatever.
You bet.
And you mentioned this much earlier in this chit chat about religions are aware of fear. Okay, the point also is discipline. Schools, getting back to my main point, schools. What can we offer that AI can't offer, that the Khan Academy can't offer, whatever, is also, besides the scholar, besides the synthesis, also discipline. I wanted to really highlight that. There is this idea of iron sharpens iron, and the fact that, we have to meet each other, and we're just out of respect for each other in the Fearology course coming up or whatever. We're going to keep that discipline, just even out of basic respect.
Exactly. Yeah, no, those are all good points. So, thanks for holding the course. Appreciate that. Thank you for all the work you're doing, and look forward to people inquire further, and you can contact John or contact me, combinations, but it's all in the document that John has loaded up on the website underneath the video.
Great. And just finally, besides that announcement, just to sweeten the pot, and also more than to do some advertisement, intimidation or enticement, I should say. Also, anyone who enrolls in this course has free access to not just the language sessions mentioned, but also all of our open events. So you can see the schedule, and those change out often enough. So check that out, and hopefully you can become part of our larger learning community. Anything else, Dr. Fisher, before we head on with things?
No, I think that's it, John. Thanks.